Support for this podcast comes from Is Business Broken, a podcast from BU's Meirotra Institute that explores questions like, why are executives paid so much? Do they deserve it? Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
WBUR Podcasts, Boston.
I'm Daryl C. Murphy, and you're listening to The Common. In February, references to the words transgender and queer were quietly purged from various National Park Service websites, following an executive order from the Trump administration. That includes pages dedicated to Boston's many national parks.
In February, a former supervisor called me on the phone saying, okay, we need to take the TQ out of LGBTQ. What do you want done with your articles?
This is Theo Linger. He's a board member with Boston's History Project, which is an organization dedicated to preserving the city's LGBTQ+ history. But before that, Theo was a ranger with the National Park Service in Boston. To say the least, Theo was shocked at the directive to take down articles about queer and transgender folks.
It was particularly gutting to get that ultimatum, specifically as a transgender person, where I was told, okay, for this article, you can either censor it and remove your own community, or you can pull down this entire thing you wrote. And I chose to pull the article down in its entirety. I did not want something with my name on it associated with the LGB. I could not in good conscience do that.
Another resource that was stricken from Boston's national parks was an audio tour of downtown and Beacon Hill titled Their Dreams, Their Rights, and Their Love. The tour was meant to show how Boston's LGBTQ+ community has lived and thrived despite oppression and erasure. Luckily, the History Project had access to the original files and was able to make the audio tour available on their website for visitors and residents to enjoy. So last week, we met up with Theo on a busy corner on Charles Street to get a taste of what the tour has to offer. First stop, the Charles Street Meeting House in Beacon Hill. It was built more than 200 years ago as a Baptist church, but it really cemented itself in local LGBTQ+ history in the 1960s when it became a Unitarian Universalist congregation under Reverend Randy Gibson.
Gibson was a staunch LGBTQ+ ally, and this meeting house became a site for assorted community events. They held dances here, which was extremely radical for any place of worship to be doing, especially considering the context that we were still in the era of gay bars being raided by police for same-sex dancing. And so to have a church hosting events of that nature was radical and different. Charles Street Meeting House remained a community space for quite some time, though today it is a privately owned mixed-use structure with businesses and private residences.
Yeah, I just went inside of the Tate.
Yes.
That is occupying some space here. It probably didn't look like that in the 1800s.
Probably not. I don't think Tate had been invented yet.
Yeah. Our next stop was a lot more unassuming. The Charles Street Garage.
This was not always a parking garage.
Also with us on our tour was Megan Michael, who is also a volunteer with the History Project, a former seasonal parks ranger, the original narrator of the audio tour, and she is also engaged to Theo. This now garage originally was a home in the 19th century belonging to Annie Fields and Sarah Orange Hewitt.
What's interesting about them is that they really represent something called a Boston marriage. Two upper-class women, usually college-educated or from that sort of background, who were able to pull their resources together and basically live together. It's a broad term because you could just be two people who didn't want to get married and kind of just wanted to be independent.
Yeah.
But in their specific case, it very much was a relationship. Annie had actually previously been married to a man named James Fields, who was a very prominent publisher here in Boston. And by all accounts, it really was a happy, loving marriage. But when James Fields passed away, She was really grief-stricken, absolutely devastated, kind of isolated herself from everyone. The only person she even let in was her best friend, Sarah Ornjewett. And they decided to kind of help her through her grief. Why don't we go on vacation? Why don't we have some fun? And while they went on a tour of Europe together, the two of them started to fall in love.
Oh, what a movie.
I know. And when they returned to Massachusetts, Annie asked Sarah to move in with her. Sarah really helped Annie come out of her grief, and they essentially got married to each other with their own personal vows, and this is something they actually reference in their writings. Sarah was actually one of the people that Annie convinced James to publish, so that's how they became friends in the first place. And a lot of Sarah's poetry had to be censored, and some of it was not even published until after her death.
Were there any efforts to try to preserve this house?
That's a really good question. So their relationship would have actually been very well known in their circle.
Yeah.
But as far as the wider public, they did keep it very secret, which is why they did censor their letters and poems and that sort of thing, which I think is probably why there wasn't a lot of efforts to preserve the home.
We are on Lindell Place, which is a little nook right off of Cambridge Street. We had to go under the Red Line where it comes up from under the ground. And we may be hearing from the Red Line at least once or twice while we're here.
It's the T. Probably not.
It may not show up. Who knows?
Yeah.
So this house that we are standing in front of right now was the home of Prescott Townsend, who was a pioneering gay activist in the early 20th century. Born in 1894, he grew up mainly in Roxbury as a kid, and he knew he was gay from a very young age. And unlike a lot of people in the... That sounds like the Red Line.
I've been proven wrong.
So Townsend, like I said, knew he was gay from a very, very young age. And unlike a lot of people at that time, he told his parents. And at the very least, his mother was pretty understanding, but she told him, be careful, because it was still very much illegal to engage in same-sex activity.
Even dancing,
let alone anything else. So he could face very real jail time. And that was especially an issue for Townsend because he came from a Boston Brahmin background.
Sounds like he had money, too.
Yes.
Old money.
So Townsend, as he got into the 1930s, he was looking for things to do. He started marching over to the other side of Beacon Hill, as far as we can tell, to the Massachusetts State House. And at the State House, he tried to petition the General Court, our state legislature, to decriminalize same-sex activity. So doing that in the 1930s was unheard of. They gave him a polite audience because of his family name, his background, but then they just kind of politely showed him the door. In 1943, Townsend was arrested. Here on Beacon Hill somewhere, he was engaging in sexual activity in a semi-public place and got caught. He was found guilty of a, quote, lewd and lascivious act and was sentenced to the maximum sentence at the time, which was 18 months of hard labor, which he served at the state penitentiary on Deer Island, where the waste treatment facility is now.
The big eggs.
Yes, the big eggs that you see out in the harbor. After he got out of prison, his reputation as an old money society man of Boston was well and truly ruined. A lot of his relatives wouldn't speak to him. He was completely struck from the social register, which, if you're not familiar, we would not be in it. It's kind of an address book for the old money wealthy. His entry just quietly disappeared. And he took this as a point of pride. He was actually excited that this happened.
Yeah,
he loved it.
Yeah.
Townsend was out here saying we should be out in the streets trying to change the laws and make big societal changes, which a lot of his cohort were just not ready for. So he spent a lot of the 1960s in this house, publishing his own newsletters, holding his own meetings. His home became a hub for a lot of young runaways, many of whom were gay, who found a cheap place to live in this house, in his place in Provincetown. He amassed a large trove of artifacts and papers, none of which we have today.
What happened?
Toward the end of his life, a series of fires destroyed the Provincetown house and the 75 Phillip Street side of the building. That's why
Series of fires.
A series of fires. Possible arsons. That was never proven or really fully investigated, but that was something that Townsend's friends always suspected had been the case. We really depend on the handful of things that survived, that he gave away to friends and that have made it into archives. And we're trying to put together what few pieces remain of this kooky, interesting, fun guy's life.
Why is it important to preserve this history personally to you both?
It's important for the LGBTQ plus community to know where we came from, to know what kind of choices people like us were making in eras of turmoil, in eras of oppression, and also times of joy. What kind of choices were people making when technically they didn't have to? LGBTQ people were not invented when Ellen came out in the 90s. We've been around since there have been people. And so, yeah, we're just a natural part of the human experience. And it's important to know that we've always been here.
We have to take a short break here, but when we get back, the last two stops on our tour of Boston's LGBTQ plus history with Theo Linger and Megan Michael. And we're back with our tour guides, Theo Linger and Megan Michael.
So we are on Temple Street looking up toward the Massachusetts State House, the sort of back of it. And somewhere on this street was the childhood home of an activist and writer named Angelina Weld Grimke. Angelina Weld Grimke was born into a mixed-race family in 1880. Her father, Archibald, had actually escaped from slavery as a young man, and he eventually became a lawyer and civil rights activist in post-Civil War Boston. From a very early age, young Angelina was engaged with these discussions of civil rights, and she wrote a lot of poetry. Her short stories, her poems, her other writings appeared in magazines, especially Black publications like The Crisis and Opportunity, which were very popular and widely read at that time in the early 20th century. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you can find her work in Harlem Renaissance anthologies. However, it is in her unpublished work that a lot of Angelina's queerness comes out. She was often, throughout her life, a caregiver for her father, who specifically did not approve of her attraction to women. And so to maintain her relationship with him, she kept this part of herself a secret. She never had any public relationships with women or men. So it's in these very private, unpublished things that her feelings come out.
For our last stop, we found ourselves standing on the steps of Boston City Hall. But before we jump into that, we mentioned earlier that Megan Michael used to be a seasonal National Parks Ranger in Boston. She left that job after a decade this year, in part because of the censoring of LGBTQ history.
It was such an important thing to me personally as someone in the LGBTQ plus community. And I was just honestly worried about the slippery slope of if we're okay erasing and hiding queer history, what's going to happen when they start going after other diverse histories? What's going to happen at a park where we interpret the history of slavery and abolition if we're being told we can't talk about that? And I was just also feeling really upset that my history was a reasonable sacrifice in the eyes of the places I worked at. and I thought it was better to just keep telling this history openly from the outside. And in a really funny way, it's almost had a Streisand effect. The Streisand effect is basically by trying to not draw attention to something, you draw more attention to something.
Yeah.
A lot of our web pages about queer history did not get a lot of attention. It was not the most popular section on our website. And now it's the only thing people are talking about. By erasing this history from the website, more people are looking into this than they ever have before.
Wow. All right, back to the past. Now, the area around City Hall Plaza actually represents several stops on the official tour. We talked about 2 with Megan.
So what's interesting about this stop is this is kind of combining 3 stops on the tour because all of them are within eyesight of each other. So the first one to really talk about is Faneuil Hall itself. It was built in 1742, first floor as a marketplace, second floor as the town meeting hall, and then really starting in especially the 1980s, the LGBTQ plus rights movement. They had something that they called gay town meeting. Which was kind of based off of the format of the original town meetings, where the community would come together and they would discuss the major issues of what was going on. How is the community responding to the AIDS crisis? How are we going to tackle this as a community here in Boston?
Yeah.
So there were a lot of prominent speakers. Probably the most famous sort of queer activist at the time was a man named Larry Kramer, who's mostly associated with New York City. He basically gave a speech asking the community, why do you want to die? Why aren't you doing more to fight against this on a government level? Why aren't you protesting more? Why isn't Boston doing more? And obviously, asking a community that is actively dying, why do you want to do this? Not the most popular way to phrase it, but it did definitely spark a deeper conversation. And gay town meetings really ran for a long time, and it is a major aspect of the hall's history, but it is not something that is any longer being interpreted as part of the hall's history. The other reason we like to stop here is not just because of Faneuil Hall, but actually because of City Hall itself.
Okay.
Because to really kind of tie this long story together, the tour really concludes in 2004 when same-sex marriage was legalized here in Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. And it was the first state in the country to do so. And the reason why City Hall is so significant is because it wasn't the state house that actually was issuing these marriage licenses. It was City Hall. The very first marriage licenses that were issued for Massachusetts were the plaintiffs in the court case that were fighting to legalize this in the first place. The Boston Globe wrote about the event, and this is really what sparked the tour itself, when they said, "This is as it should be. The question of gay marriage has always been simply and fundamentally about people, their dreams, their rights, and their love. It is a day for Massachusetts citizens to take pride in once again being at the forefront of revolution."
That was Megan Michael, volunteer with the History Project and former seasonal National Parks Ranger for Boston, and also Theo Linger, board member at the History Project and a former National Parks Ranger. The full Their Dreams, Their Rights, and Their Love audio tour is available on the History Project's website. And that's our show for today. Thank you so much for listening to The Common, which is produced by myself and Franny Monahan. It's mixed by Marquise Neal and edited by Yasmin Ammer. And our theme music is Me from Hisu. And from the newsroom of WBUR, I'm your host, Daryl C. Murphy. I'll talk to you next week.